Imagine being torn from your home, your family and your land, and forced into a life of brutal labor. This was the harsh reality for millions of Africans during the Atlantic slave trade. But what exactly was the Atlantic slave trade? The Atlantic slave trade, lasting from the 15th to the 19th century, was a system where Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. It was driven by European colonist demand for labor to work on plantations, in mines, and in other industries. And the victims? They were not just individuals, they were entire communities and cultures. In just over 400 years, historians estimate that around 12 million Africans were taken from their homelands and forced into slavery. This was not only a trade of people, it was the beginning of a painful, global history of exploitation and racism. How did the Atlantic slave trade start? It all began with European exploration and the desire for wealth. By the late 1400s, European powers like Spain and Portugal were exploring new territories in Africa, the Americas, and beyond. They needed labor for the sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations they were setting up in the Americas. Initially, they enslaved Native Americans, but disease wiped out large numbers of them. So, European traders turned to Africa for workers. The Europeans didn't go to Africa directly to capture people. Instead, they traded with African rulers and slave traders who had their own networks of capturing slaves. These slaves were then sold and transported across the Atlantic, beginning the horrific transatlantic journey. Now, let's talk about the Middle Passage, the most terrifying and inhumane part of the journey. This was the name given to the horrific voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, where enslaved Africans were packed into filthy, overcrowded ships with barely enough room to breathe. Conditions were appalling. The journey could take months, and many slaves didn't survive. They were chained, beaten, and starved. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and malaria spread rapidly. It's estimated that up to 2 million people died during the Middle Passage alone. This voyage wasn't just a physical journey. It was a spiritual and emotional journey of despair, as people were taken away from everything they knew and loved, heading into an uncertain future of forced labor and suffering. The effects of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa were devastating. Millions of people, especially young men and women, were taken from their homes. Entire societies were disrupted. Communities lost their strongest, healthiest members, and many families were torn apart forever. The demand for slaves also led to increased warfare and violence within Africa. African kings and traders fought to capture people from rival tribes to sell them to European traders. This left a lasting scar on the continent, one that affected its political stability, economy, and social structure for generations. Moreover, the trade caused a massive loss of culture, as countless Africans were scattered to foreign lands, separated from their languages, traditions, and identities. European nations played a central role in making the Atlantic slave trade a global business. Nations like Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands established powerful trading networks, often working with African slave traders. These nations built entire economies around slavery. For example, Britain's powerful naval fleet controlled the sea routes, and the profits from sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations made wealthy individuals and nations even wealthier. The profits were staggering. Ships carrying slaves brought back goods like sugar and cotton, fueling industries back in Europe. Entire cities grew rich off of the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved people. So, how did the Atlantic slave trade come to an end? The movement to abolish slavery began gaining strength in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, fueled by abolitionists who saw the brutality and injustice of slavery. In 1807, Britain passed the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal to participate in the slave trade. The United States followed with the abolition of the international slave trade in 1808. But while the trade itself was abolished, the legacy of slavery didn't end. The effects of the Atlantic slave trade are still felt today. Slavery shaped the economies of the Americas, built on the backs of enslaved people. The racial inequalities that grew out of slavery continue to affect the lives of African Americans and people of African descent all over the world. Understanding this history is key to understanding the challenges many face today. The dark legacy of the Atlantic slave trade still shapes our world, but by confronting it, we can work toward a future where such injustices are never repeated. To sum up, the Atlantic slave trade was one of the darkest chapters in human history, with lasting impacts that stretch into the present day. By learning about this tragic period, we gain insight into the cruelty of slavery and the resilience of those who endured it. But knowledge alone is not enough. We must continue to fight against injustice in all its forms and work to make the world a place where dignity and respect are given to every human being. Let's never forget the lessons of history and always strive for a better future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more insightful videos. Let's keep learning from the past to build a better future.